I've been investigating cold cases for over a decade, but nothing prepared me for what I discovered about the Teixeira family. It was March 2004 when I first heard about them from a retired Alaska state trooper who couldn't forget their faces. The way he described it, something about their case had haunted him for 15 years. Carlos Teixeira, 42, was a successful contractor from Portland, Oregon. His wife Maria, 38, worked as a school librarian and had always dreamed of seeing the Northern Lights. Their two children, Sofia, 16, and Miguel, 12, were typical teenagers, excited about an adventure that would take them far from the familiar streets of their neighborhood. The family had saved for 3 years to afford this once-in-a-lifetime trip to Alaska, planning to stay in a remote cabin near Denali National Park for 2 weeks in February 1989. What struck me most when I first saw their photographs was how ordinary they looked. Carlos had kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, always wearing flannel shirts that made him look more like a professor than a contractor. Maria had long dark hair she kept in a neat braid, and her smile suggested someone who found joy in simple things. Sofia was at that awkward teenage phase, trying to look older than her years, while Miguel still had the boundless energy of a kid who believed the world was full of endless possibilities. They were the kind of family you'd see at a grocery store or school event and never think twice about. Yet something about their planned vacation would lead them into a mystery that would baffle investigators and haunt a small Alaskan community for decades. The cabin they rented belonged to an old-timer named Frank Morrison, who had been renting it out to tourists for nearly 20 years. It sat 40 miles from the nearest town, accessible only by a winding dirt road that became treacherous in winter. Frank later told me he had mixed feelings about renting to families with children, especially during Alaska's harsh February weather. But the Teixeiras seemed well prepared and experienced with cold weather camping. They had brought proper gear, enough food for 3 weeks, and Carlos had called twice to ask about the cabin's heating system and emergency procedures. Everything about their planning suggested they understood the risks and had taken appropriate precautions. I spent weeks retracing their journey, studying maps and weather reports from that February. The family had flown into Anchorage on February 14th, Valentine's Day, which Maria had mentioned in a postcard she sent to her sister. They rented a 4-wheel drive SUV and drove north, stopping in several small towns along the way. Gas station attendants remembered them because Miguel had been excited about seeing moose, asking everyone they met about the best spots for wildlife viewing. Their last confirmed sighting was at a trading post about 15 miles from Frank's cabin, where they bought extra batteries and some warm socks for Miguel, who had complained his feet were cold. The clerk remembered Maria joking that they were city folks trying to survive in the wilderness, but she seemed happy and relaxed. Frank Morrison found their abandoned SUV on February 28th, exactly 2 weeks after they were supposed to check out. The vehicle was parked normally outside the cabin, covered in a thin layer of snow, but otherwise undisturbed. The front door of the cabin was unlocked, and inside, Frank discovered something that immediately made his blood run cold. The family's belongings were scattered throughout the rooms, but not in a way that suggested violence or struggle. It looked more like they had simply vanished in the middle of their daily routine. Sofia's homework was spread across the kitchen table, half finished. Miguel's comic books were stacked neatly beside his sleeping bag. Carlos had been reading a book about Alaskan wildlife, with a bookmark still marking his place on page 157. The strangest detail was in the main room, where someone had started a fire in the fireplace but left it to burn down to cold ashes. On the mantel above sat 4 coffee mugs, each still containing what appeared to be hot chocolate that had long since grown cold and developed a film on top. It was as if the family had been sitting together, perhaps planning their next day's activities, when something had caused them to simply walk away from everything they knew and disappear into the Alaskan wilderness. Frank immediately called the state police, and within hours, the first search teams were mobilized. The initial search lasted 6 days and involved over 50 volunteers, including experienced trackers and search and rescue teams from 3 different counties. They found no footprints leading away from the cabin, no signs of struggle or violence, and no indication of where the family might have gone. The weather had been unusually mild for February, so hypothermia seemed unlikely, especially since they were experienced outdoors people who had brought appropriate gear. Search dogs were brought in, but they seemed confused, unable to pick up any consistent scent trail leading away from the cabin. It was as if the Teixeira family had simply evaporated into the thin mountain air. Detective Sarah Walsh was assigned as the lead investigator, and she approached the case with the methodical precision that had made her successful in previous missing person cases. She interviewed Frank Morrison multiple times, questioning whether he might have had any involvement or knew more than he was admitting. Frank passed 2 polygraph tests and provided detailed alibis for the days surrounding the disappearance. Sarah also investigated the family's background, looking for any signs of financial trouble, marital problems, or other issues that might have motivated them to disappear voluntarily. What she found instead was a family that seemed genuinely happy and stable, with no debts, no criminal history, and no apparent reason to abandon their life in Oregon. The case generated significant media attention throughout 1989, partly because it seemed so inexplicable, and partly because the Teixeira family represented every parent's worst nightmare about vacation disasters. America's Most Wanted featured the case twice, and there were numerous reported sightings throughout Alaska and the Pacific Northwest, but none proved credible. Maria's sister, Elena, traveled to Alaska 7 times over the following 3 years, organizing search parties and offering rewards for information. She refused to give up hope that her sister's family might still be alive somewhere, perhaps suffering from amnesia or being held against their will by someone who lived off the grid in Alaska's vast wilderness. As the years passed, the case gradually faded from public attention, though it never completely disappeared from the consciousness of those who had been involved in the initial investigation. Detective Walsh, who retired in 1998, later told me that she kept the case file on her desk until her last day on the job, always hoping that some new piece of evidence would emerge. Frank Morrison continued renting his cabin to tourists, but he never forgot about the family who had vanished from his property. He installed new locks and a security system, though he couldn't explain exactly what he was trying to keep out or keep in. The breakthrough came in March 2004. Exactly 15 years after the disappearance, when a commercial fisherman named Bill Hendricks was working the waters near Valdez, about 200 miles southeast of where the family had vanished. Bill had been fishing these waters for 30 years and thought he had seen everything the ocean could offer up in his nets. That morning, his trawl brought up something he had never encountered before, a leather-bound journal, partially preserved by the cold salt water, wrapped in what appeared to be a waterproof plastic bag that had developed a small tear. When Bill opened the journal back at the dock, he immediately realized he had found something significant. The first page contained an inscription that read, "Property of Sophia Teixeira, Portland, Oregon." Bill had never heard of the Teixeira family, but something about finding a teenage girl's diary in his fishing net troubled him enough to contact the Alaska State Police. Within hours, Detective Mike Chen, Sarah Walsh's successor, was examining the journal in the department's evidence lab, wearing latex gloves and trying to contain his excitement at this unexpected development in a case that had been cold for over a decade. The journal's pages were damaged by salt water, and many entries were illegible, but what could be read painted a disturbing picture of the family's final days at the cabin. Sophia's handwriting, typically neat and controlled in the earlier entries, became increasingly erratic as the days progressed. Her initial entries were typical teenage observations about the trip, complaints about the cold, excitement about seeing wildlife, and gentle mocking of her parents' attempts to rough it in the wilderness. But starting around February 22nd, her tone changed dramatically. "Something is wrong with this place," she had written in an entry dated February 23rd. "Dad keeps talking about sounds in the walls, but Mom says it's just the wood settling in the cold. Miguel thinks he saw someone watching the cabin from the trees, but when we looked, there was nothing there." The entry continued with descriptions of strange occurrences. Objects that seemed to move by themselves, sounds of footsteps on the roof at night, and a persistent feeling that they were being watched by unseen eyes. Most disturbing was Sophia's account of her father's behavior, which she described as becoming increasingly paranoid and erratic. The final legible entry was dated February 27th, just one day before Frank Morrison would discover the abandoned cabin. Sophia's handwriting was barely recognizable, shaky and urgent. "Dad says we have to leave tonight. He found something under the cabin that scared him. He won't tell us what it was, but I've never seen him look so afraid. Mom is crying, and Miguel keeps asking questions nobody will answer. Dad says if we don't leave now, we might never be able to leave at all. I'm scared. I don't understand what's happening to us." The entry ended abruptly, as if Sophia had been interrupted while writing. Detective Chen immediately organized a new search of the cabin area, using ground-penetrating radar and bringing in cadaver dogs to search for any remains that might have been missed during the original investigation. What they found beneath the cabin would haunt everyone involved in the case for the rest of their lives. Hidden under loose floorboards in the crawl space was a metal box containing dozens of photographs, newspaper clippings, and personal items that appeared to belong to other families who had stayed at the cabin over the years. The photographs showed families similar to the Teixeiras, parents with children, all smiling and unaware of whatever fate awaited them. Some of the newspaper clippings dated back to the 1970s, describing missing persons cases throughout Alaska and the Pacific Northwest. Detective Chen realized they weren't just investigating the disappearance of one family, but potentially dealing with a serial killer who had been using Frank Morrison's cabin as a hunting ground for decades. The personal items in the box, a child's bracelet, reading glasses, a wedding ring, represented lives that had been cut short and families that had never received answers about their loved ones' fates. When confronted with this evidence, Frank Morrison broke down and confessed to a crime spree that had lasted over 20 years. He explained how he had developed a system for targeting families who rented his isolated cabin, particularly those with children, who would be missed, but whose disappearances could be attributed to the dangers of the Alaskan wilderness. He had been careful to space the disappearances over time and across different locations, making it unlikely that any single investigator would notice the pattern. The Teixeira family had been his final victims, and their disappearance had troubled him so much that he had never killed again. Morrison led investigators to several burial sites scattered throughout the remote areas around his property, where the remains of 13 people were eventually recovered, including the Teixeira family. The forensic evidence suggested that Carlos had indeed discovered Morrison's collection of trophies under the cabin and had tried to evacuate his family before Morrison could act. Unfortunately, they had not been fast enough to escape. Morrison's confession filled in the missing pieces of Sophia's journal entries, explaining the sounds in the walls, the feeling of being watched, and her father's growing paranoia as he began to realize the true nature of their situation. The case of the Teixeira family became a landmark in Alaska criminal law, leading to changes in how remote cabin rentals are regulated and monitored. Frank Morrison was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, where he died in 2011 at the age of 73. The families of his victims finally received the closure they had been seeking for decades, though the knowledge of how their loved ones had died brought little comfort. Elena Teixeira, Maria's sister, established a foundation to support search and rescue operations in Alaska, ensuring that other families wouldn't suffer the same uncertainty her family had endured for 15 years. What haunts me most about this case isn't just the horror of what Morrison did, but how a simple vacation dream became a nightmare that destroyed multiple families across 2 decades. The frozen diary that Bill Hendricks pulled from his fishing net that day contained not just Sophia's final thoughts, but the key to solving one of Alaska's most prolific serial murder cases. Sometimes I wonder how many other cases might be solved if we knew where to look for the evidence that victims leave behind, the desperate messages they try to send us from beyond the grave. The Teixeira's story reminds us that evil can hide behind the most ordinary faces, in the most beautiful places, waiting for innocent families who just want to make memories together. Their tragedy led to justice for 13 families and potentially saved countless others who might have become Morrison's future victims. Yet questions remain about how many other Frank Morrisons might be out there, using the vastness and isolation of America's wilderness to prey on families seeking adventure and togetherness in remote locations. The investigation into Frank Morrison's other victims consumed the next 2 years of my life. Each burial site he revealed became a crime scene that told its own horrific story, and I found myself becoming obsessed with understanding not just what he had done, but how he had managed to do it for so long without detection. The forensic anthropologist assigned to the case, Dr. Rebecca Martinez, worked tirelessly to identify remains and piece together the final moments of Morrison's victims. What we discovered was a methodical killer who had refined his techniques over 2 decades, learning from each murder how to better conceal his crimes and select victims who wouldn't be immediately missed. The earliest victims dated back to 1978, when Morrison first inherited the cabin from his uncle. The first family was the Hendersons from Seattle, parents Jim and Carol, with their twin daughters aged 8. They had come to Alaska for Jim's 40th birthday, seeking adventure in the last frontier. Morrison later confessed that killing the Henderson family had been impulsive, driven by a psychotic break following his wife's death from cancer 6 months earlier. But instead of feeling remorse, he described experiencing a sense of power and control that he had never felt before. The isolation of the cabin and the vastness of the Alaskan wilderness had provided the perfect laboratory for him to explore these dark impulses. Over the years, Morrison had developed a disturbing ritual around each family's final days. He would spy on them from hidden vantage points around the cabin, learning their routines and personalities before making his move. He installed hidden cameras in 1985, allowing him to watch families more closely and decide the optimal timing for his attacks. The photographs Detective Chen had found weren't just trophies. They were part of Morrison's selection process, documenting families he deemed suitable victims. He preferred families with children between the ages of 8 and 16, believing they would be less likely to fight back effectively and more likely to comply with his demands out of fear for their parents' safety. Dr. Martinez's analysis of the remains revealed that Morrison's methods had evolved significantly over time. The early victims showed signs of blunt force trauma, suggesting he had killed them quickly and without much planning. But by the 1980s, his approach had become more sophisticated and psychologically cruel. Later, victims showed evidence of prolonged captivity, with some having been held for several days before being killed. Morrison had constructed a hidden room beneath the cabin's foundation, accessible through a concealed trapdoor in the pantry floor. This underground chamber, which investigators dubbed the Tomb, contained shackles, a crude ventilation system, and personal items from each family he had imprisoned there. The discovery of the tomb explained many of the strange details from Sophia Teixeira's journal entries. The sounds in the walls that had frightened her father were likely the cries of previous victims who had been held in the underground chamber. The feeling of being watched was accurate. Morrison had been observing them through the hidden cameras, studying their behaviors and planning his attack. Most chilling was the realization that the Teixeira family had been living directly above the final resting place of Morrison's previous victims, sleeping peacefully while the bones of murdered families lay just feet beneath their beds. Morrison's confession sessions with FBI profiler, Dr. James Kellerman revealed a man who had been fundamentally broken by personal tragedy, but had channeled his pain into an elaborate fantasy of power and control. He spoke about each family with disturbing intimacy, remembering details about their conversations, their fears, and their final moments. He claimed that he saw himself as a collector of experiences, preserving perfect family moments by ensuring they would never be tainted by the disappointments and tragedies that life inevitably brings. In his twisted logic, he believed he was doing his victims a favor by allowing them to die while they were still happy and together. The psychological profile that emerged painted Morrison as a highly intelligent psychopath who had used his ordinary appearance and friendly demeanor to lure families into trusting him. Neighbors in the small town near his cabin described him as helpful and reliable, someone who would plow driveways in winter and help fix broken generators. He had served on the volunteer fire department for 12 years and was known for his generous donations to local charities. This facade of respectability had been carefully constructed to deflect suspicion and maintain his access to potential victims. What troubled me most during the investigation was discovering how many close calls there had been over the years. Several families had reported strange experiences at Morrison's cabin to local authorities, but their complaints had been dismissed as typical urban dwellers struggling to adapt to rural Alaska. A family from California had reported seeing someone watching their cabin from the woods in 1983, but when deputies investigated, they found no evidence of trespassing. Another family had complained about items going missing from their cabin and strange noises at night. But Morrison had convinced them that bears were the likely culprits, even providing them with bear-proof containers that were actually designed to make their food more accessible to him during his nighttime surveillance. The town that had been Morrison's hunting ground for over 2 decades struggled to come to terms with the revelation that their helpful neighbor had been a serial killer. Property values plummeted as news of the murders spread, and several longtime residents moved away, unable to reconcile their memories of the man they thought they knew with the monster he had revealed himself to be. The local sheriff, who had known Morrison personally and had even shared beers with him at community events, suffered a nervous breakdown and was forced to take early retirement. The psychological impact on the community was profound and lasting, creating an atmosphere of suspicion and fear that persisted long after Morrison was imprisoned. Teixeira's foundation became a lifeline for the families of Morrison's other victims, providing not just financial support for funeral expenses and travel costs, but also connecting survivors with counselors who specialized in helping families cope with violent crime. Through her foundation, Elena organized annual memorial services where families could gather to remember their loved ones and support each other through their ongoing grief. These gatherings became powerful demonstrations of resilience and community, showing how human connection could provide healing even in the face of unimaginable tragedy. The ripple effects of Morrison's crimes extended far beyond his immediate victims and their families. The FBI used his case as a training example for profilers studying serial killers who target families, and his methods influenced changes in how remote rental properties are monitored and regulated. Alaska implemented new requirements for background checks on property owners who rent to tourists, and several other states adopted similar measures. The case also highlighted the vulnerability of families traveling to remote locations and led to the development of new safety protocols for wilderness tourism. As I compiled my final report on the Morrison case, I found myself haunted by the randomness of how his victims had been selected. The Teixeira family hadn't been targeted because of anything they had done or any connection they had to Morrison. They had simply been in the wrong place at the wrong time, seeking a beautiful family experience that turned into their destruction. This randomness made their fate somehow more terrifying than if there had been some logical explanation for why they had been chosen. It served as a stark reminder that evil can strike anyone, anywhere, regardless of how careful or prepared they might be. The final chapter of the Morrison case came in 2011 when he died in prison of a heart attack. His death sparked debate about whether justice had truly been served, since he had avoided execution and died of natural causes rather than facing the same terror and pain he had inflicted on his victims. Some family members felt cheated of the opportunity to see him suffer as their loved ones had suffered, while others expressed relief that his death meant he could never harm another family. Elena Teixeira, who had become the unofficial spokesperson for all the victim families, issued a statement saying that Morrison's death allowed them to finally close this chapter of their lives and focus on honoring the memories of those who had been lost. But even with Morrison dead and buried, questions about his crimes continued to haunt me. During his confession sessions, he had hinted at other victims beyond those he had led investigators to, suggesting that his killing spree might have been even more extensive than anyone realized. He mentioned families who had disappointed him by leaving the cabin early or failing to meet his selection criteria, implying that there might have been other murders that were never connected to him. The vastness of Alaska, with its countless remote locations and transient population, made it impossible to know for certain whether Morrison had been responsible for other disappearances that had been attributed to accidents or natural causes.